Turn in your Bibles, please, to the book of 1 Corinthians. This, my design in this has been primarily, let's do this more as a Bible study than as a sermon. And so I'm going to read some things from chapters 9 and 10, and we want to see something about Paul's declaration of liberty, Paul's rights. And then we'll talk something about a lesson from history. And we want to see how these things come together too. The church at Corinth, and I've mentioned this a number of times, the church at Corinth was the most corrupt church that we know of in the entire New Testament. They had many, many problems. And one of the problems that they had was, for want of a better word, I just have to say, they had some arrogant people in the congregation who didn't really care what other people, how they were affecting the other people in the congregation. And so as we talked about last week in the 8th chapter there, these people had been converted from paganism. And so the sacrifices that were made to idols, well, that meat sometimes was sold or given to people and, as food. Well, actually, the Old Testament sacrifices that we have in the Law of Moses were very much the same way along that line. Most of the animals, only a small portion of the animal was burned, and then the rest of the animal was given either to the priest or back to the person who offered the sacrifice, and they had a banquet, they had a meal together and all of this. And so it wasn't just burning up all these animals. And when the meat sacrificed to idols, when that meat was offered to people, some people said, wait a minute, now I'm a Christian, I don't think I'd better eat meat that's been sacrificed to an idol. And so then Paul says, hey, meat is meat. Meat is meat. And in the 10th chapter, in the 8th chapter, he says, there's nothing wrong with this. However, here is a new Christian, a weak brother. How do you treat that guy? Well, you respect his conviction and you respect his weakness. Here's the thing. You invite him over to your house for dinner. And which is not a bad idea, folks. You invite him over to your house for dinner and you serve roast beef. And you put the roast beef down there, and this weak brother, he said, was that meat offered and sacrificed to an idol? Yeah, but it doesn't make any difference. But the weak brother says, I just don't feel right in doing that. Paul says, in chapter 8, Paul says, respect his weakness. Respect his weakness. Respect him. And don't say, oh yes, this was offered to him. Forget it, it's okay. Oh, go ahead, everybody does it. No, he says, respect this man's weakness. Well, some of them were saying to themselves, and apparently practicing this, something along this line. I am free. I am free in Christ. I am no longer tied to those idols. I am a free man. Consequently, my salvation is secure. I kind of live any way I want to. I can have respect for you or forget it. I can forget you. And so Paul says, you're not acting in love when you do that. And so Paul says in the 9th chapter, Paul says, I am free. I am an apostle. But he says there are certain limitations on my freedom. You see, freedom without discipline is addiction. Freedom without discipline is addiction. I say, okay, I'm free to do anything I want to. So what do? I allow myself to indulge all of my desires and all of my wants and all this sort of thing. And so I'm free. So I take drugs. I'm a drunkard. I'm all this and I'm all that. I'm immoral and all this sort of thing because I'm free. And what happens? I become addicted to my own appetites. I become addicted to my own desires. Now, I'm no longer free. I'm really in bondage. I'm in bondage to my own desires. And so Paul talks about that in this section of the Bible. Now, let's read. There's some more to this that's very, very important, and you'll see the reason I say it's very important in just a minute. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord Jesus? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Okay, Paul says, yes, I'm an apostle. I'm not inferior. They've been accusing him apparently of that. I'm not inferior. I'm an apostle. And certainly to you people, because you are the converts that came as a result of my work and service, surely to you, I really am an apostle. Now, here's something that he says that's interesting. Well, it's very interesting to me as a preacher because you'll see why. In the 7th verse, he begins talking at that point, he begins talking about his right to receive remuneration, to receive money for preaching the gospel. Well, that's okay. Is it okay to pay the preacher? Yeah. Everybody say yes. All right. But Paul says, he introduces it like this. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the grapes? Who tends the flock and does not drink of the milk? Do I say this merely for a human point of view? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. Okay, that's a little bit strange maybe to some of us, but I saw this one time over in the Holy Land when I was over there. They would pile up their grain. Let's just say wheat. They'd pile the grain up on a floor, and how do you get all of the husks, off of the little seeds of grain, of wheat? Well, they would get an oxen, and they'd tie the oxen to a post, and the ox would just walk around and walk all over this thing, and the weight of the oxen would break the little hulls off, and then the farmer would have a big shovel, and he would shovel it up and throw it up in the air, and the wind would carry all these husks away. And that's the way they threshed their grain. That's the way it was done. I actually saw that one time. And it's just a real interesting thing. And by the way, when John the Baptist was being challenged, he spoke of this very thing. Now, here's the thing. I'm an ox. Not really. I'm an ox, though, and, I'm walking around there, and, hey, this is pretty good. And I reach down and lick up some of the grain. Oh, no, you're not supposed to do that, ox. So they put a muzzle on the ox, and the ox can't do it. And so God put in the law of Moses, when you're using an oxen to thresh your grain, he needs to be paid, folks. Let him reach down there and lick up some of the grain. So there was a law in the law of Moses. You don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. So now Paul says a soldier is paid. A keeper of vineyards, he eats the grapes, he drinks the juice. One who is caring for animals, for sheep or cows. He drinks the milk. The ox, he is even allowed to do that. And so in verse 9, he says, isn't it written that do not muzzle the ox when he is treading out the grain? Is it about the oxen that the Lord is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap material harvest from you? And so he's defending the fact that he has the right to receive money for his work. That's just the way life works. When we work, we're supposed to be paid. And so he says, these are the illustrations that God has given us and that we see in life. Now, what does this have to do then with Paul as an apostle? Paul as an apostle says, I have the liberty, I have the right to be paid for my work. And then he comes along and he says, however, I made my own living, he said. He says, I did not preach the gospel to you for any kind of remuneration at all. I made my living as a tent maker. And if you read the book of Acts, you'll find out that that's what he was, and that's what he did. Now, in verse 15 he says, but I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing to you in hope that you will do such a thing for me. I would rather die than to have anyone deprive me of this boast. He says, I'm very proud of the fact that I preached to you for nothing. And he says, don't pay me, because I like to be able to boast about this. Paul had a real good sense of humor. He said some very sarcastic things sometime. Now, though I am free, in verse 19, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Now, in this verse, he comes out with the real motivation behind the thing. When I first started preaching, a great man who got me started to preaching, and by the way, he's dead now, but his widow is still living, and she's over 100 years old. And I call her on the phone every once in a while, and just to remind her how much she and her husband have meant to me. He made a statement to me one time that I've never forgotten. When I first started preaching, he said, Jack, you're not going to be paid very much for preaching. Well, I knew that. I understood that. He says, there'll be some churches that will pay preachers a whole lot of money. He said, the chances are very, very slim, or he said something like this, the chances are very slim that you will be preaching for a church that'll pay you a whole lot of money. Well, he was right. But that's all right. But he said, one of the things you need to remember is that men who preach for money, and there are some, men who preach for money can be paid not to preach, or in other words, find a better job in industry or something like that. And I always thought, the way he put it, if you can be paid to preach, you can be paid not to preach. Okay, that was the way he expressed it. Well, I'm not trying to say anything in reference to myself. Like someone said a while back, said, Jack, you enjoy preaching, don't you? I said, yes, I enjoy preaching and teaching. And he says, I bet you'd do it even if you didn't get paid, wouldn't you? I said, yes, I would. Well, why? Not because I'm such a holy man. I'm a long way away from that. But it's because I really enjoy doing what I do. I genuinely enjoy that. And this was what Paul was getting at. He was getting at the fact that I have the right to be paid but I'm not exercising that right. He says, I'm free as an apostle, and you are my harvest in this great work. Now, this actually leads him into the 10th chapter. The 10th chapter is an interesting thing because it draws on history. And now keep in mind the things that I said just a moment ago about these these people that ignore the weaknesses of others, and I'm looking out for number one, and they don't consider the infancy and the need for growth in other people. And so they just ignore their obligation, responsibility to that. Paul basically says, now I want you to learn a lesson from history. Learn a lesson from history. Let's read a portion of the 10th chapter then. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the facts, brothers, that our forefathers were under the cloud, and they passed through the sea. And they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They ate of the same spiritual food, and they drank of the same spiritual drink. For they drank from a spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. Let's pause here for just a moment. If you really want to read some depressing literature, but some literature that has great lessons for us, sit down and read the story of the Exodus. How the people, God did, just think of the things God did for them. They were in slavery, yes. And so God sent Moses. And Moses was the one who led them out of Egypt. What took place with all of this? Pharaoh kept saying, no, I'm not going to let the people go. God worked at least 10 miracles right there. And the plagues, you remember, the plagues of darkness, the plagues of flies, the plagues of gnats, the plagues of disease of the cattle, the plague of boils, and so forth and so forth. And all of these things took place in the realm of nature, but they were the interventions of God. And God did all of this in order to get Pharaoh finally to say, get out of our land. And they did. And so God did a whole lot of things for them. When they ran out of food, God provided manna. When they ran out of water, He provided water from a rock. You know what they did? Gripe, 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 gripe. They complained. When things didn't go just the way they wanted them to, they complained. And so they were people who murmured. Well, let me tell you, when I was in the Holy Land, we flew from Egypt. This was back in about 1967. And we flew from Egypt over to Jerusalem, Jordan. And we flew right over part of this desert that these people were in. We left Cairo and flew over there, and we flew over part of that desert. And I remember sitting there with my wife, and we looked out the window of the plane. It was an old DC-4, by the way, a four-motor prop plane. And not a very good pilot. He had to make 2 different shots at trying to land that thing. So it was kind of an exciting trip. But as I looked out the window, I turned to my wife and I said, good night. This is the desert that the Israelites came over. I don't blame them for griping. I don't blame them for murmuring and complaining. If I was down there, I believe I'd have joined them. I'd have said the same. Why in the world did you bring us out here? But the point is, God guided them and cared for them. And there was a pillar of cloud by day that led them, a pillar of fire by night that provided light for them, and all of this sort of thing. And God provided food for them. Their clothes didn't wear out. All kinds of good things like that. But notice what He said in that 5th verse. God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered over the desert. Complaining is serious. And they rebelled against Moses. They rebelled against God. And, on one occasion, well, on more than one occasion, on at least two occasions, they said, Moses, and they had been slaves in Egypt, Moses, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? We'd have been better off over there. All we've got to eat out here is manna. And so they said, why didn't, at least when we had a varied diet when we were slaves. Sometimes we complain and we don't realize how blessed we are. How blessed we are. So God was not pleased with most of them. Now, notice the 6th verse. Boy, this is a good one. Now, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they indulged in pagan revelry, or they rose up to play. Okay, one of the strangest things that happened on this trek, they came to Mount Sinai. Moses went up on the mountain, he received the law. But one time when he went up on the mountain, he was up there for over a month. Over a month. And they came to Aaron, his brother, and kind of the spokesman for Moses, and they said to Aaron, we don't have any idea what happened to this guy Moses. He's been gone all this time. We want you to make us a god. Make us a god. And so Aaron, what did he do? The golden calf. That's what Aaron did. He made a golden calf. So the people now forgot about what God had done for them, and they began worshiping this golden calf. It's just unbelievable, isn't it, that they would have done a thing like that. Yet that's what they did. And so Paul says, learn some things from history. And here's what they did. They worshiped the golden calf. You need to remember something. Paganism thrived on the ideas of self-indulgence. And sexual perversions of every description were many times, usually, a part of that. And so, like he says here, they committed all kinds of sexual acts in this worship of the golden calf. And so it was said, the people sat down to eat and drink, and then they rose up to play. Well, what are we going to learn from that? What are we going to learn from that? Life is not always exactly the way we'd like for it to be. I just wish that all my life, everything had gone exactly the way I wanted it to. And then when I look back on it, I say, oh boy, I'm so glad it didn't go that way, because some things that I really thought I wanted and some situations that I really thought would be advantageous and beneficial to me, they were gone. It didn't work that way. And I had prayed and prayed and prayed about these things. Lord, this is the best thing for me. I know it is. Bring it to pass. No, didn't come to pass. Didn't work. And I was so disappointed. I was despondent about some of those things early on. And then all of a sudden I realized, wow, if I had gone ahead and gotten to do that, or that event or those situations had come about the way I wanted them, my life would have been miserable, folks. And so sometime when God says no to us, we need to thank Him just as much as when He says yes to us. And there are a lot of times when God just says, no, Jack, you don't need $1 million, Jack. If you had $1 million, it may take you away from me. If you had this, it may take you away from me. So, Jack, here are some things that you need to keep in line. No, it's not exactly the way you'd like for it to be, but God says, I know what's best for you. You know how much I love the book of Habakkuk. And this is just such a perfect illustration of this. Why doesn't God Why doesn't God act more? Why doesn't God do more that I can see that's needed? I mean, you can look around the world and you can say, or around our country, or maybe around our city, or your own neighborhood, or whatever, and you can say, good night, this is really bad. Why doesn't God intervene? Why doesn't God do something about this? This was Habakkuk's thing. Habakkuk said, God, there's all kinds of evil in my nation, and you're not doing a thing in the world about it. Why, God, are you? He put it in more eloquent language than this, but like I said this morning, I'm not an eloquent speaker anyway. God, why haven't you taken care of the evil in our own nation? Look out, and the nations all around us. Look how evil and wicked and immoral they are, and God, you're sitting around in heaven not doing anything at all about it. Why don't you do something about this? And you know, people today are saying pretty much the same thing. If there's a God, why is he allowing suffering? If there's a God, why is he allowing this? If there's a God, why is he this? And so forth. People have a lot of questions about that. Well, God answered Habakkuk. And he says, Habakkuk, let me tell you something. Yeah, there's a bunch of evil in Israel. You know what? I'm going to get the Babylonians to come over and punish Israel. Not good. God, the Babylonians are worse than we are. God says basically this. He said, trust me, Habakkuk. I know what I'm doing. Trust me. Habakkuk then says, oh, I understand. The righteous live by their trust, by their faith. That became the theme of the book of Romans over in the New Testament. In the first chapter, the 16th and 17th verses of Romans. And he says, as it is written, the righteous shall live by their faith. And so what is the message here from history? The message from history is we've got to learn from the examples, the mistakes, and the good points of people back in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a most fascinating book. It really is. It's just a fascinating book. And when we learn something about that, we can see the Israelites and so many things that they did that just fell through. And so many times they were punished because of their lack of trust. And Paul says here, hey, these things happen as examples to us. Now, there's a flip side of this. Verse 11. These things happen as examples and were written for as a warning to us on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So, if you think you're standing firm, now get this, if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Or as it's usually expressed, let him that thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. It's so easy for us to feel strong when we're weak. It's so easy for us to be so arrogant that we say to ourselves, you know, nothing can get me away from the Lord, and then some catastrophe happened, and we say, where are you, God? If that's the kind of God you are, I don't want anything to do with you. I had a friend in Atlanta, Georgia, and I baptized this man and his wife. And then after we moved away from Atlanta, we came back through, and she had died. And I saw this man as a good friend, and I said, well, Bob, how are things going now that Maxine has died? He said, Jack, I cannot believe in a God who would allow that kind of suffering. I've heard that before, and probably you have too. But the whole idea is Bob had become a strong Christian, but then something came along that Bob couldn't handle. And instead of relying on God for comfort and consolation, and saying to oneself, Lord, I don't understand the whys of this, but I accept what's happening. I know you're a God of mercy. I don't understand this. I know you're a God of goodness, but I don't understand this. But I'm not going to allow it to destroy my faith. And so Paul talks about this whole thing of how it is that learning from the fidelity of men in history, learning from the mistakes of the men in history, by doing that, we see much more about how God can guide our lives. And so a look at history sometime, particularly the Old Testament, a look at history helps us in our faith in Christ.